Amen. Our gospel passage this morning is full of details. We hear facts about specific people. We hear about Jairus. We're told his name, that he was the leader of the synagogue. We're told towards the end of this reading the fact that his daughter was 12 years old. There's even information provided to us about how these different encounters with Jesus take place right up against each other. There's Jairus who comes, and as soon as he sees Jesus, he goes straight to him, falls on his knees, and begs him repeatedly to come and help to save his daughter, who he believes is dying. And contrast that with what we're told about this unnamed woman who's been suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who we're told comes up behind Jesus in the thick of the crowd. And all she wants to do is touch part of his clothing. Last week, the rector had mentioned how suffering can have that character whereby it feels as though what we experience when we're in pain feels as if it's only ever happened to us, that it is unlike anything that anyone else has ever gone through. And this morning we see and hear that suffering is perhaps not the only thing that can have that kind of quality, but rather healing can too. As many of you may know, I last year had a miscarriage just after the New Year. And in the course of that taking place, my husband and I wound up at Beaumont Royal Oak, and we were in the radiology department, and I can remember so many things about that particular point. I can remember the layout of the room. I can remember where the lady who was doing the ultrasound was sitting. I can remember there was like a television screen. I remember where Giles was. I remember the lights were dim. And I stayed still where I was and was full of feelings that I don't really like to think about. Of, the fear, the impending sense of disappointment, because it would go on to make itself known that I was having a miscarriage. And also mixed in with that some desire just to know what was going on, because I'd had these symptoms that didn't really seem so good if you were pregnant, and yet it was the first time in my life where I felt not at home in my own body. It was happening to me, but I couldn't tell you what it was. And at some point, as I lay there, I realized that the lady doing the ultrasound had some music on in the background, and I recognized it. In the way that you do music, sometimes you think, oh, I know this, and then you have to sort of unpack, well, where on earth do I know it from? Because there were no words. It was just a sort of instrumental. And I realized that it was a hymn that I had heard, not in this country ever, but that I knew from hearing it in England, in the little church that I first went to when we arrived there, when I was 11. And it's a reworking of the psalm, and it goes like this. It says, "As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone can my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. And of course, I wasn't hearing that out loud, but I was hearing those words in me. And with all these details that I can recall so well now and look back on with such awe, even as it didn't change the course of things, there was this moment of healing for me that was so much tied to what I needed to experience of God being present to me. And in our gospel, we find the same. We have two people, and they need particular things. One of them is asking Jesus for healing on her own behalf. The other one is asking on behalf of his daughter. And we then find, therefore, this sort of potentially crystallized portrait of what healing can look like. You are interceding from somebody else. You're asking because you need the healing. And then, perhaps less obviously, towards the end, you may also sometimes find yourself in the crowd. And we're told, in the Greek it says, they were amazed with amazement. It's like you can't even put into words what it felt like, what it meant to them to actually see this thing that had taken place in front of them. And so healing, with all of this, can seem like a very personal thing, and can be and is a personal thing, and it can seem that it's only a question of the individual. It can seem as if this story is really just about a woman, a father, a daughter, and some people watching. But in the Christian life, while healing is a personal experience, it is undoubtedly a communal affair. And we hear in the short reading from Wisdom this morning that when God created all things, he created all things so that they might exist. Not so that they might die, not so that they might suffer, but that they might exist and live and flourish. And so the healing, the flourishing, the existence that God is concerned with is not simply you or I, or those who are immediately around us, but rather with the entire body of God's children. And so we start to open up this sense of what healing is, who it happens to, where we look for it, and how powerful our God really is at being able to bring about the redemption, the healing of the world. The cultural anthropologist, American Margaret Mead, she was asked at one point, during the course of her archaeological sort of digs, she was asked, what is the thing that you look for as evidence of a civilized, as they would put it, community? And the person who asked the question was thinking it would be something along the lines of a tool, evidence of agriculture, something like that. And what she said was that what she looked for as evidence of a civilized community was a healed human femur, a healed human thigh bone. Because she said, if you found one of those, you knew that somebody else had to hunt on that other person's behalf. In a prehistoric community, somebody else needed to go out and find food and give it to that person while they were unable to do so, in order for that bone to have time to heal. And this was Completely different from the communities that abounded where you didn't find such things. You didn't find a healed human femur. You found rather evidence of arrows that had pierced temples, and you found evidence of clubs being used to wound and likely kill people. And in those kinds of communities, there wasn't any room for the sort of pity or the sort of empathy, we might say, that would have allowed for an injured person who was unable to fend for themselves to have the time and the ability to heal without the care of somebody else. So in the Christian life, we are involved in one another's healing, and Margaret Mead's words show us that, but we go further, because on the base level, at any point in life, we will find ourselves in the position of the hemorrhaging woman, as she's known, where we desperately need something to come through, and we need God to show up. And you may be in a point like this now, and you may recall a time where you did, and you had exhausted every opportunity, used every strategy, consulted every wise person you could think of, and had to at a certain point say, I've got nothing. And you may find yourself at the same time also being in the position of Jairus, where you are pleading for healing and restoration on somebody else's behalf. And mystically enough, as a Christian, you can find that you can be in both or either of those places, and at the same time, in that need, still see God working in the world and be amazed with amazement at what God can do. But there is more even than that we are entrusted with and also encouraged by, and that is opened to us in this seemingly random portion of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians this morning. Paul is writing to all these little house churches in Corinth, and he's actually in the middle of asking them to take a collection, an offering, to support the believers in Jerusalem. And these house churches in Corinth, the people that go to them, they're never going to meet those people in Jerusalem. They'll never see them. They'll never have any kind of intimate relationship. And Paul is utterly convinced that that doesn't matter half so much as what Paul calls the generous act of Christ, which is to be their own generous undertaking, which is that they are to care for those needing help, whether they can see them or not, whether they know them by name or not, because the character of God is to create so that all things might exist, so that, as we hear over and over in the gospel, so that all people may be made well. And this generosity and this sacrifice that Paul talks about, where Christ wasn't rich and then simply said, let me share with you my riches, but Christ was rich and became poor. Christ gave up what he had so that we might share in it. This sacrifice and this generosity is the hallmark of Christ. And Paul says to us this morning, then, there is a need when we look at all the places that are so prominent to us, whether they're on a personal or a global level or anywhere in between, when we see people in need of healing, we are called to do something, and more importantly, Paul says, to have the desire to do something. And I confess to you, as the very fortunate mother of a beautiful baby, it has been the strangest thing to navigate being a new parent with all the second guessing and all the uncertainty that that entails, whilst knowing that there are so many children and so many babies who are not with their parents right now. And it's not just in our country, and it's not simply at a border. That's one kind of suffering, that's one group of people. And it's one thing to not know how to comfort your child, it's another thing not even to have the opportunity to try. The well-being of all people is what God is about. And we have the charge of caring about the healing of the world, not simply because we live here and we live now, but because we're Christians. And it is only a godlike thing where God can hold all the details of the healing with the enormity of the suffering and use humble, lowly, meek little us to do something about it. Margaret Mead, as well as being a cultural anthropologist, was also, it turns out, an attendee of the Episcopal Church. And I leave you with some words of hers for which she is, I think, far better known than she is her thoughts about healed human femurs. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." What distinguishes our call in the path of Christ is that we are called to act and to speak and to listen, not out of fear, but out of faith, and not out of anger, but out of love. So God, make us thoughtful and faithful and committed. God, grant us humility, and by the power of God's Spirit and God's own risen Son, our healing Lord, send us out to do the work God has given us to do. Amen.
Amen.